gender equality and gender gaps analysis undertaken in OECD is very much of a horizontal activity. The OECD ambassadors meet regularly to discuss the work on gender equality in a group called the Friends of Gender Equality Plus. And so they discuss the work that is going on in a wide range of areas that touch on gender and gender equality. And so in our work, particularly on trade, we've worked in other folks who, we've worked alongside other folks who, for example, specialize in micro and small enterprises. So we did a whole paper on women in trade, women business leaders of small and medium enterprises in trade. And that came out in the OECD SME and Entrepreneurship Outlook publication that really is destined toward the SME community, the SME policymaker community. We also work with many organizations outside OECD. With the WTO, we contributed a chapter on women in aid for trade, aid for trade programs that have a gender focus. We did that with our colleagues working in the WTO Secretariat, and that was part of the global review, Aid for Trade Global Review. We know that women-led firms, for example, are generally smaller than those led by men. So there is, in a way, what is good for micro and small enterprises is also good for women-led firms. But women face additional hurdles. For example, in accessing finance. Women have less access to finance coming from small and micro firms than men business leaders. And some studies have also shown that women founders of startups have faced a lot of harassment, including sexual harassment. One study in Europe suggests that 30% of women looking for investment funding have been propositioned with investment funds for sex. Wow. So that's where we're at. And in other areas, digital access, for example, and access to digital services are an issue particularly for small business leaders. We learned during COVID how important this area is, but online harassment, for example, affects women more than men. And this isn't only women business leaders, it's also politicians, journalists. Some women business leaders hide their identity online to avoid harassment. But these kind of behaviors leave the door open for abusive behavior by competitors or someone with a grudge. And so, we know that firms that are active online are more likely to reap the benefits of trade. So we're really at the beginning, teasing out the implications of trade. But this is an important aspect of our work because we know that Indigenous peoples have trade in their DNA. They traded long before they came into contact with Europeans. We know this is the case in Mexico. There's much evidence of that in North America as well. The importance of the canoe in Indigenous communities for transportation, for livelihood, but also for trade. And so we're starting at the OECD by identifying future areas of future research. And we're doing that by discussions with Indigenous groups and with policymakers. So one area is just that, engagement of governments with Indigenous groups. We know that is done in a certain way in New Zealand with treaty partners. In Canada, there are different groups and different ways of engaging and consulting. And elsewhere, it's done differently. So we want to discuss those different models of engagement and bring those to OECD, where there is a vast difference in experience. In New Zealand and Australia, there's a difference with, for example, countries in Latin America. One of the areas that we want to look into is intellectual property and protection of traditional knowledge. This is a difficult area. There is already a lot going on in the international space. And we know that there are concerns in this area on the part of Indigenous peoples. So we want to bring those and discuss what those concerns are and whether we can find responses in that space. Another area that we want to look into is gaps that impede Indigenous businesses from trading, whether those are digital gaps, access to finance, skills gaps, access to business networks. And of course, we need more data. Data on Indigenous people in labor markets, on Indigenous peoples in leadership, and in trade.